Good morning, Year 10. So, we are going to be looking at a poem today. We started having a think about the ideas around this poem last lesson when we started to look at the title of it, Bayonet Charge. Now, I've stolen this idea from Mr. Compton because I think it's absolutely fantastic. He does the poetry pledge with his classes, and now the poetry pledge is a promise that we will remember to write about the poem 4 things, so only 4 things about the poem. You don't have to remember all of the poem, so 4 quotes to remember, a little bit on the structure of the poem and the context, so a little bit about how the writer has been inspired by something to write this poem, or a little bit about what was going on in wider society when this poem was written. So if we remember about for structure, context, then we will be doing very well with our poetry analysis. So this is our pledge to poetry. So we'll start off. Learning objective today is to understand and write about the poem Bayonet Charge. So let's start with the about then. I want you to think, as I read this poem through, what do you think the poem is about? What is it telling us about the horrors of war and the result of following orders? We talked a little bit yesterday about should we follow orders even if we know that it's going to end in a bad outcome, and this poem kind of addresses that. Okay, so think about what the poem is about and what it's telling us about the horrors of war and the result of following orders. Okay, so the poem starts, "Suddenly he awoke and was running raw. In raw seemed hot khaki, his sweat heavy, stumbling across a field of clods towards a green hedge that dazzled with rifle fire, hearing bullets smacking the belly out of the air. He lugged a rifle numb as a smashed arm, the patriotic tear that had brimmed in his eye, sweating like molten iron from the centre of his chest. In bewilderment, then he stood almost stopped. In what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations was he the hand pointing that second? He was running like a man who had jumped up in the dark and runs, listening between his footfalls for the reason of his still running. And his foot hung like a statuary in mid-stride. Then the shot slashed furrows, threw up a yellow hair that rolled like a flame and crawled in a threshing circle, its mouth wide, open, silent, its eyes standing out. He plunged past with his bayonet towards a green hedge. King, honour, human dignity, etc., dropped like luxuries in a yelling alarm, to get out of that blue crackling air, his terror's touchy dynamite." Okay, so some slightly more challenging language in here, and I don't expect you to understand, everything fully the first time round you read it. I certainly didn't. So some keywords, clods. It says stumbling across a field of clods towards a green hedge. Clods just means thick lumps of mud. So bearing in mind, this man would be running across no man's land on this battlefield, which would have been rained on. People running across it. It's been completely upturned, and it would be really, really muddy. So not very nice setting to be in, not just because of the guns around them, but actually the physical setting as well. Patriotic, so it says the patriotic tear that brimmed in his eye. It's that feeling of being proud of your country and being proud to be British in this case. So perhaps he is proud to be part of his country at the beginning of this poem. Bewilderment. It says here, in bewilderment, then he almost stopped. So at this point in the poem, he's starting to feel really confused about why he's there, why he's fighting. He doesn't see the point anymore. A hair It says, and threw up a yellow hair that rolled like a flame. So you've got this idea that nature and the war are almost against each other here, and you can see that this like big rabbit, I suppose, it is caught up in the midst of it as well. It might be a symbol of fear, for example. If you say that somebody is yellow, it can also mean that they're a coward. So maybe it's showing his fear here too, through the sort of metaphor of the yellow hair. And then finally, dignity. So he lists here 3 things: so king, honour, human dignity, etc., dropped like luxuries in a yelling alarm. So they're the reasons that he's gone out to war: for his king, for honour, and then dignity, so being worthy of honour and respect. So to sort of prove himself, I suppose. But all these have been dropped like luxuries in a yelling alarm, so he's almost like he's had to forget about those, so he can actually survive. He's not really thinking about these things whilst he's physically out at war. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is to go back to that question then. So I've said, what do you think the poem is about? What's it telling us about the horrors of war and the result of following orders? So what is the result of him following these orders? And how is this person feeling? I'd like you to write down a couple of sentences to explain that. So make sure you've got your title, Bayonet Charge by Ted Hughes, and then you can write a little section saying about and write that down. Pause the video here. Okay, so this poem is about a man who's at war in World War I. He's running through no man's land. He almost stops in the middle of no man's land. As it says, if you look back to here, in bewilderment, then he almost stopped, and then he starts to question himself and why he's there. So he questions why he's there. He mentions the reasons he enlisted, so king, honour, human dignity, etc., but says that they are dropped, so they're no longer important to him. He realises that war is futile. He sort of sees war as pointless. He doesn't really understand why they're all doing this, why there's so much hurt as he's out at war. Okay, so if you haven't got any of these notes within your notes from when you answered that question, you can copy down some of these now. You can pause the video here. Okay, so that's about done. So we've got about, and then we've got for, structure and context. So let's move on to for. So these are 4 quotes, 4 parts of the poem that you can analyse in great detail and you'll be able to write about in the exam. So here is one line. I think the first line is absolutely fantastic. This first line, suddenly he awoke and was running raw. Okay, so I want you to think about these 3 questions. The first one being, why start with the adverb suddenly? What does it tell us about his surroundings? What is it like during this war? If he starts with suddenly, he awoke and was running. What kind of atmosphere does Hughes create in the first line of the poem? And what do you associate with the word raw? Okay, so I'd like you to write down the quote. So write down this bit in purple, and then as you answer these questions you can annotate, so draw lines off the text. So for example, where it says, you know, why start with the adverb suddenly, you might want to write your answer off by drawing a line off suddenly and then writing your answer there. What kind of atmosphere, you could write it underneath. And then what do you associate with the word raw? You could highlight it. You could draw a line off the word raw and then write your answer there. Okay, couple minutes, pause the video here. Okay, so let's go through some of the answers then. So why start with the adverb suddenly? What does it tell us about his surroundings? Well, there's a special word for this. This is a particular technique we call starting a poem or a story in the middle of the action, we call it in medias res. Okay, so it's a nice phrase to use within your analysis. So you could say Ted Hughes, who's the poet, starts in medias res because it shows that there's a lot of action going on. It really throws us into what the situation was like in World War One on the front line. It makes it seem almost a little bit jumbled and confusing, and you know, the kind of feelings that they might have felt actually being on the front line. In terms of the atmosphere is quite traumatic. You know, he's not waking up and in his bed and having a stretch and, you know, before, you know, getting a cup of tea. He's awake and he is running, and this is, you know, raw could be meaning raw emotions. It could be raw as in, you know, his feet are completely covered in blisters and it's sore. You know, the seams of the clothes they're quite rough, and you know they've been rubbing against him. He's been in the same clothes for days, that sort of thing. And the atmosphere is just one that is incredibly stressful. You can imagine the fear that these soldiers would have felt, and you know, it's not that they're using, you know, more modern technology and snipers and what have you, and it's not you know, further range. This is a battle where they're using bayonets, and we said last lesson, you know, using a bayonet means that you've got a knife at the end of your rifle because you're going to be experiencing close range combat. You're going to be fighting people right up against you, potentially having to kill them with a knife, and that's going to be very, very traumatic. So the atmosphere here within this first line, this suddenly he awoke and was running, really does throw us straight into the action and makes it feel quite a stressful scene. Okay, so next quote then, we've got, he lugged a rifle numb as a smashed arm. I want you to think, here he's comparing his rifle to being like a smashed arm. What technique is that? Okay, first of all, what is the technique that's being used here? And how does this poet view the rifle? If he's saying that it's numb as a smashed arm, if he's comparing it to a smashed arm, how useful is this rifle? And what words show you that it's useful or not very useful? Okay, so I want you to write down your quote again and then write down your answers around your quote. Okay, pause the video here. Okay, so comparing this rifle to being as numb as a smashed arm, because it's using like or as and it's comparing, this is a simile. Okay, and this simile kind of tells us that this rifle isn't very useful. If we've got the word smashed arm, if we think of a broken arm, there's not a lot you can do with a broken arm. It's not very useful. So this writer, this poet, is saying that his rifle is essentially useless within this situation. Why is it useless? Well, I mean, you could think that perhaps because he's having to go straight into no man's land, there's plenty of opposition here, that it's not really going to be that much support for him. It's not that much of a support mechanism for him when you've got hundreds of people shooting at you as you run across this field with no cover. So he compares it to being like a smashed arm, and that word numb as well I think is really important. Numb could be physically numb. He could be feeling numb from the cold and being out in the open elements for so long. He could be feeling emotionally numb. You know, he's had to put everything to the back of his mind. Perhaps he's got family at home, perhaps he's feeling really scared, but he's just got to let all his emotions go and do this awful task. So the word numb can be both physically and mentally here. Okay, let's move on to the next section then. So this is quote number 3 out of the 4. So he was running like a man who has jumped up in the dark. So I want you to think, what technique is used in this line? And what does the phrase "to be in the dark" mean? How do you think this man is feeling based on this line? Okay, so pause the video here. Write down your answers. Write down the quote. Okay, so the technique used in this line is a simile. You know, he says, like a man who's jumped up in the dark. It's a comparison. The phrase "to be in the dark," like where it says sort of up in the dark, it means to be, you know, in the unknown, to not know what's going on. So I suppose we could say that almost metaphorically, this line is telling us that he doesn't really know what he's doing. He's feeling very confused. We get the adjective. It's an abstract noun in the earlier part of the poem. It does say that in bewilderment he almost stopped. Bewilderment meaning feeling confused. So we get this man totally confused. He's not able to sort of see through what's going on, and he's feeling very, very sort of startled by everything he's seeing around him. Okay, final one then. So we've got king, honour, human dignity, etc. dropped like luxuries in a yelling alarm. So he lists king, honour and human dignity as reasons for going to war. What technique is this? King, honour, human dignity. Okay, so what's the technique? And how important do his reasons for going to war seem now? What words show that? Okay, so write down the quote, answer the questions. You can annotate around your quote. Okay, pause the video here, have a go now. Okay, so king, honour, human dignity is a rule of 3. Okay, so he lists 3 things. And then straight afterwards he puts etc. Kind of making it sound like it's not really important. It's like, yeah, list these things, yeah, etc, etc. So now, although these things were once important to him, this use of the rule of 3 and then etc. afterwards kind of makes it seem like he's just listing them off, like they're not really that important anymore. This is then reinforced with the dropped like luxuries. Also a simile. It's almost like if something's a luxury, then it's not needed, it's not necessary, it's just something nice. So they're not important anymore because of this yelling alarm, the war that he's in, you know, this really loud and awful situation that he's been put into. So this seems futile. This seems like it's not really important anymore. He's just fighting for his life. It's no longer that he feels like he's fighting for the king. He's not fighting for his honour. He's just fighting to survive here. Okay, so you can get down those notes if you haven't got them down already. And then finally, we can move on to structure. So, structure. This poem is written in the 3rd person. So it's not I went and did this and I went and did that. It's written about a man in the 3rd person. So it's almost like we can sort of see the situation as an overview. It's not like we're in the situation with him. The lines are uneven and sporadic. They use enjambment and caesura. So enjambment is when you've got a line that runs on. So for example, where's a good example? He was running like a man who jumped up in the dark and runs. You know, this line doesn't end here with a comma or a full stop. It carries on to the next line. Caesura is when you're using punctuation in the middle of a line. So for example here, this is a great example. In what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations was the hand pointing that second? Question mark. He was running. Okay, so because it's not using the sort of standard structure we expect from a poem, where we get lots of rhyme and we get commas at the end of the lines and it sounds quite pleasant, making it uneven and sporadic and having this irregular rhythm as well reflects that panic or struggle. It's all over the place, really. And that reflects how he's feeling and the panic and the difficulties and stress that come with, you know, being in the middle of no man's land when you're at war. So the structure of this poem, not just the words, but the structure, actually tells us something about how this persona is feeling. The initial feelings of pride at the start of the poem, you know, like the patriotic tear that we get at the beginning, this soon turns to fear. You know, he's dropping these reasons for going to war, and he's just trying to survive now. So as the poem goes on, we get this sense of him feeling more and more fearful, you know, stopping in the middle of the poem to question what's going on as well. Okay, so make sure you've got some notes down for structure. If you need to pause the video here, please do. And next we're going to move on to context, our final part of our poetry pledge. Okay, so finally context. So this is what Ted Hughes has said. He said, "When I first started writing, I wrote again and again and again about the First World War." So he's clearly fascinated by World War One. Well, why did World War One inspire him? There are three key reasons here. The stories told by his father, who'd survived his regiment's massacre at Gallipoli. So he had actually been out to war, so he'd heard these stories from his father. A love of Wilfred Owen's poetry. Now we will study a poem by Wilfred Owen. Wilfred Owen is a fantastic poet who experienced World War One, and it was really sad actually, because Wilfred Owen fought in the war, came back home, and then got sent back out again, and you know, fought for a very long time, and then produced these poems about war. And unfortunately died literally 1 week before Armistice Day, so 1 week before the war ended. So Wilfred Owen has inspired Ted Hughes to write World War One poetry, and the West Yorkshire landscape where he grew up, Ted Hughes, as well was an inspiration, because he felt that the whole region is still in mourning for the First World War. So yeah, there are his three reasons for writing about World War One. He's heard stories from his father. He's got that interested in Wilfred Owen's poetry, and you know, in West Yorkshire, it feels like they're still mourning for that. Okay, so there you go. That is the about, for, structure and context for Bayonet Charge. So that's brilliant. It means that you've got a really good overview of what the poem is all about, and hopefully you're able to analyse some key parts of that poem. So we'll continue with this over the next few lessons. We'll be looking at a variety of different poems to do with power and conflict, and we'll start to compare the different types of poems there are. Okay, well done today, and hopefully see you soon.